This time we pay homage to Honda's irrepressible CX500. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Now the story starts in 1984 when I was doing an awful lot of kart racing. I'm not going to tell you how it went, but let's put it this way, I didn't turn out to be the next Nigel Mansell. But the thing was, the karts were kept a few miles from my home at my uncle's house, and to get there, he picked me up on his motorbike. This was a CX500. This was my first encounter with a decent sized motorbike. I had been carried on my dad's Honda Cub before, but that really wasn't the same. This was my first experience of a real motorcycle, if you will, and it completely blew me away, and I was hooked for life. As a consequence, I've got a real soft spot for the old 500. Now, Honda began work on a machine to counter motorcycles such as BMW's Boxers in the mid-70s. Clearly the machine was influenced by the Moto Guzzi V-twin, although there were earlier Japanese bikes with the same layout such as the Lilac. Now Honda being Honda, they weren't going to build a machine which was exactly the same as Moto Guzzi's. For example, their machine was water-cooled and had the gearbox cast integrally into the casing, rather than a separate gearbox that you find on the Guzzi or BMW. And after initially building the engine as a 90-degree V-twin, they brought the angle down to 80 degrees to make the machine a bit more compact. This would lead to slightly higher vibration when compared to a Guzzi engine, for example. Despite running overhead valves, the machine ran a very high compression ratio and had a rev ceiling of just shy of 10,000 RPM. This meant the bike kicked out around 50 horsepower, which was pretty respectable by the standards of the day. This was then transmitted to a 5-speed gearbox and onto a shaft drive. The water cooling made the engine quiet and very smooth, but the only real downside was that given the limitations of manufacturing techniques back in the late 70s, it did add quite a lot of weight to the overall machine. But the healthy dollop of mid-range torque from those 4-valve heads meant that this was largely offset on the road. The machine was fairly typical Honda, solid and reliable and refined, but the styling was a little bit staid. It was influenced a little bit by Moto Guzzi's Le Mans, but it really lacked the panache of the Italian bike. Nevertheless, it was a very popular machine with dispatch riders. First models received almost universal praise by the media. The only downsides that were noted was that the fairly straightforward twin-shock rear setup couldn't really cope with the weight of the bike, and it could all get a little bit bouncy when you tried to push on a bit. There were a couple of mechanical issues. The main one was that on some early bikes, early crankshaft failure was noted. Honda did move quickly to their credit and fix the problem. Another issue which would, to some extent, dog the bike throughout its life was cam chain wear. Was it ever so for Honda back in the 70s? Essentially, the cam chain would wear out and go very sloppy and rattle around at fairly low mileage. Apart from that, the bike was pretty much bulletproof. Following quickly on the heels of the first model came, of course, a custom model. These were very popular at that period. And then for the American market in particular came the GL or Goldwing 500. This was essentially the custom model with lots of bodywork. This made a sort of mini Goldwing and was a really useful, almost kind of lightweight cruiser bike. You could certainly tour on one, as the CX engine is very good at motorway speeds. The only downside I've ever noted on them is there's a slight buzziness, which can sort of make your thumbs go numb. This often occurs at around 80 miles an hour, but at most speeds the bike is really smooth and very pleasant to ride. Now for a time I ran a CX500 alongside my V50 Moto Guzzi. I can honestly say that you couldn't find two more different bikes particularly when you consider they're based around essentially the same engine layout. But the differences really did make a big difference. The Gutsi was low, long and very light. The CX was quite a bit more powerful, but it was also much taller, decidedly heavier, and with that neat trick of putting the gearbox inside the crankcase, it had a much shorter wheelbase, so it turned surprisingly well for such a big heavy machine. 1982 would see a major upgrade of the design. As well as a turbocharged version arriving, yes, that's right, a turbo, there was also the CX500 Eurosport. This had a reworked and improved motor, an all-new chassis with single shock suspension at the back, and completely new updated styling. And of course it now had a disc on the back, so it did stop a bit better than the old model. And with the new chassis, it certainly handled quite a bit better too. And for me, of course, most importantly, it looked a hell of a lot better. And it was one of these bikes that I would use while I was training, alongside my Gutsi V52. And it was the Eurosport on which I took Deb on our first date, way back in 1992. This was an ideal bike for this sort of thing. I fitted luggage to it, so it was great for touring. It had a large tank, so fuel range was brilliant. But it was big and roomy and very comfortable. So for carrying passengers, there really wasn't a better bike around at the time. And of course that shaft drive meant that lazy old me didn't have to muck around with the drive chain. So it was nice and clean too. That excellent mid-range punch meant that it pulled beyond its capacity and felt like a much larger bike when you pushed on. I held on to this bike until I finished my training, when I changed it out for a CBR 600F, much to Deb's annoyance, because the F was a lot less roomy. In fact, it was damn cramped on the back, and it didn't have the mid-range punch or the convenience of the CX. And it may surprise a lot of people, but side by side, I thought the CX was a much nicer bike in terms of handling than the CBR was. It was a bit more stable, and okay yet to sort of muscle it around a bit, but it didn't squirrel, it didn't behave unnaturally in crosswinds, and it just felt a lot nicer bike to ride. Damn sight more comfortable too. Now in terms of engine performance, the Eurosport didn't really change the game at all from the original CX. The turbo, however, very much did. And power was lifted from around 50 horsepower to a little over 70, giving a considerable jump in top speed, as you can imagine. Now the turbo did share most of its components and bodywork with the Eurosport, understandably. But it also featured a very neat half fairing. This did a great job of keeping the wind off the rider and really did provide a very comfortable ride at motorway speeds. It was a damn sight more efficient than the small bikini fairing which had been fitted to the Eurosport, but even that actually provided surprisingly good wind protection for such a small device. But the turbo version really did move the game on considerably in terms of weather protection. To many, the CX seemed an odd choice to turbocharge. It was a very popular thing to put turbos on bikes at one time, and most of the Japanese companies tended to use across-the-frame fours for this. But actually the CX makes a lot of sense. The gap in between the V's created room for a lot of the plumbing that the turbo required. And also, the mid-range punch of the engine and low down grunt really complemented the lag that you get from a turbo sometimes before they spool up, meaning that what you got essentially was a bike with excellent real-world performance. Unfortunately, it just didn't sell. It was only produced for about a year before a 650 version replaced it with a little bit more go. But the fact is, turbo machines never did really take off, because people simply reasoned you could buy a larger capacity bike that got the same performance for less money and less trouble. And by 1983, as well as a turbocharged 650, there was also a Eurosport 650 and various other versions of the new 650 engine, including cruisers of course. And in some markets there was also a 400cc version, where taxation laws meant that this was a very desirable capacity. By the mid-80s, Honda felt that the CX had pretty much had its day. They introduced a replacement, the VT500. This was a V-twin, like the CX, and was shaft drive, but it orientated its V in a rather more conventional way. But the machine, oddly enough, was never as successful as the CX. Maybe it just lacked the character of the CX. Because oddly enough, the Japanese are kind of famous for never creating bikes with much character about them. The CX, however, was different, had a personality all of its own, and was really the darling of the dispatch riders throughout the 80s and 90s. For me, essentially, the CX500 is motorcycling's ABBA. Because while it's never been cool and trendy, it's always been really good at what it does, and as such has earned the respect of anybody that's ever owned and ridden one. And today, well over 40 years since the bike first appeared, it's become a very popular machine amongst customisers, and there's a real subculture for designing calf racers around the old custom model in particular. So in its golden years, the machine has managed to become what it never was in its youth. It's now become cool and trendy. CX500, we salute you. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, a big thank you for watching.